Yeah, I think with support and, awareness, these neurodiverse children have so much to offer the world because we're outside the box thinkers. We're going to come up with a solution to something that somebody who thinks more laterally perhaps won't.
Welcome to All Aboard, where we help parents navigate the ADHD journey. Whether you're at the beginning of this journey asking what now, or you've trodden this path for a while and are wondering what's next, All Aboard ADHD is here for you. We will bring you key information from expert interviews, inspiring special guest stories, and parents sharing their real-life lived experience to help you feel less alone. I'm Claire, and today we'll be talking to our first special guest, Rachel Fuller. Rachel is a successful composer, arranger, and singer-songwriter who has been making music since she was 10 years old. Rachel's teenage years were filled with performing, studying music and songwriting. Then, in her early 20s, she made the move to London, quickly establishing herself as an in-demand orchestrator. It was during this time in 1996 that she met Pete Townsend of The Who while working as the arranger on his Lifehouse Chronicles album, and they later married in 2016. Rachel's creative journey is deeply intertwined with her personal experiences. Diagnosed with ADHD in her late 40s, she navigated childhood challenges within the confines of mainstream education, emerging with a profound understanding of difference. These experiences inspired her to create Be as a way of celebrating and empowering neurodiverse children, which Rachel says is for every child who feels different or struggles to fit in. Be is the story of a child with a beautiful mind who feels out of place in the world. Be is often misunderstood and struggles to concentrate and connect with others, until their fairy friend Sprout takes them on a magical journey to show them that everyone has special talents and that difference is what makes us extraordinary. Uniquely combining words, music and beautiful illustrations by Amelia Wharf, Be explores themes of difference and acceptance, addressing and celebrating neurodiversity along with the importance of cultivating individual talents and sharing them with the world. Even the book's colour palette has been carefully created with neurodivergent sensitivities in mind. Be originated as a ballet commissioned by the Royal Ballet and Opera Education, with Rachel composing the original orchestral score to accompany the story. The book features QR codes that give readers access to the music, taking them on an enchanting journey beyond the page into an immersive and multi-sensory experience, encouraging creativity, interaction and self-expression. Rachel is here to share her ADHD story with us today. Welcome aboard, Rachel.
Oh, welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today for our first special guest episode. Can you begin by telling us about when you were diagnosed with ADHD and what prompted you to get that diagnosis? And I guess also what you felt when you finally had that answer.
So this is an interesting question, and it always takes me by surprise how emotional it makes me feel. I got diagnosed completely by chance. I was 50. And I'm nearly 52 now, so it was well over a year ago. And a friend of mine had come to stay in the lockdown, and he had really struggled with some mental health issues. He's an artist, a brilliant artist. And he came to stay. My husband and I live in the countryside. It's very beautiful. We've got lots of space. So he said, can I come and stay for a week? And we said, yes, of course. And while he was there, we were chatting and he said, I've just been diagnosed with ADHD. And I think it's really important that I'm brutally honest, even though it doesn't make me look very good. I did sort of an inner eye roll because I honestly believed that ADHD was not a real thing. I'd heard it, for the last 10 years, perhaps it's been sort of in the public consciousness much more. I thought it was just naughty kids whose parents were like gentle parenting, and, this was a lack of sort of proper parenting, and kids were being allowed to sort of run about in class and be really disruptive and all the rest of it. So when my friend said they'd been diagnosed, I said, the eye roll was inner. I said, what does that mean? And he said, well, it means that this and this and this. And I said, yeah, well, I do that. And then he said, and this and this and this. And I said, well, I do that. And he said, but also, this and this and this. And I said, babe, everyone does that. And he said, no, they don't. And I thought, anyway, we chatted about it. And I was interested enough to buy a book called Driven to Distraction, which was one that he had recommended. And I got the book from Amazon and I looked at the contents and I saw the sort of questions, to see whether you've got ADHD, and I skipped to that. And one of the first things it said is, did you skip to this section of the book straight away? And I was like, Anyway, so I read all these questions and they were sort of mind blowing to me, because I thought, is this not something that, well, I knew it wasn't something everybody did, but it was laid out in such a clear way and I could see myself. And I thought, oh, okay, so maybe it's not a made up thing. And I was very confused, but I thought what I'll do is I'll go and see a specialist and I'll go for a diagnosis. So I went to an ADHD specialist up in London. And first of all, I had to fill in this form, which was about 12 pages long, which was like my worst nightmare, filling in forms. But also my husband had a questionnaire to fill in, and my elder sister. So it was somebody who'd known me as a child and somebody that knows me as an adult. So I went in for my appointment, and it was a good few hours long. And the psychologist looked through all my questions and my husband's, and she said, unquestionably, you have ADHD. And I was like, oh, okay. So, well, I've probably got ADD, because I definitely don't have the hyperactivity thing, because I nap every day. And I have done since I never really grew out of it from when I was a toddler. And she said, no, that's because you wear yourself out. You need to have a break. And I was like, oh. And so that's how I discovered I had ADHD. And I didn't do like a deep dive, because I think the thing about the internet is it's fabulous. But if you go searching, there's going to be so many different theses. And I didn't want to get confused. So I thought I'll be advised by my diagnosis, and I've got this book, and I'll find out a little bit more about it. And it was just eye-opening to me and sort of mind-blowing at the same time, because I think I find it quite hard when I talk about this not to use the odd swear word. So I'll try to think of a different word. The thing I think that was most profound for me is that I had grown up knowing that I was a decent human being, knowing what my strengths were. I'm generous, I'm funny, I'm kind, I care about people. I knew that I had all of those assets, but I also had a lot of what I deemed character defects. So I was impatient, I was intolerant, I sort of couldn't help but interrupt people. I talked over people. I found people boring, like when they were talking. I was always like waiting for my turn to talk. If I walked in somewhere and there was a queue, I just was like, I'm not queuing. When we travel, waiting for the bags to come out in the baggage hall was nightmarish for me. And if we had traveled business, I used to think, this is outrageous that the business class bags don't come out first, and then I would think, oh God, you're so entitled. Like, why are you so entitled? So there was a lot of negative self-talk around what I felt was either an emotional failing, a personality failing, or even a spiritual failing. And I found it very difficult in the evenings to ever just sit and be still with myself. I had to get up, make a cup of tea, I had to sit down, I had to go to the toilet, I had to get down. I was watching a bit of telly, I used to go to the fridge, and I thought, you are unable to spend any spiritual time with yourself at all. So that was the biggest impact for me from a psychological point of view, that I begun to realize and accept that it wasn't because I was a bit of a dickhead. That's probably, so despite all my positives, there was a lot about me that really wasn't great. And to realize that, and this is as I believe it, I'm not, a doctor or a miracle, worker, but my belief is that ADHD really is a physical condition, and that it is caused by brain chemistry issues, that we don't have enough dopamine. There's insufficient dopamine. And I'd only ever heard this word dopamine in connection with chocolate and reward and pleasure. And I didn't realize that it was also an inhibitor. And so when you don't have enough dopamine, you physically don't have the ability concentrate, to focus, to pay attention. Impulse control is another thing, regulating your emotions and your emotional response. So once I felt that ADHD as a physical thing was a bit like a diabetic who just doesn't make insulin. And you don't sit down with someone who's diabetic and ask them about their childhood and how they live in the world. You give them insulin, and for me, it felt like that. It felt like this is not, I don't need to work on myself anymore. I don't need to work on I understand now that this is a physical condition. And just knowing that really helped me. Anyway, I feel like I've just spoken for about 20 minutes.
No, not at all. I mean, firstly, thank you for your honesty, because I think you are not alone in that initial response as you shared to your friend's diagnosis. And I think sort of wherever you fall in that, whether it's in relation to your own diagnosis or when you're facing this with your children for the first time, I think there is a degree of that, because actually, certainly at that stage, none of us really fully understood it. I know my diagnosis followed my son. So a little bit like you, I sort of discovered myself through somebody else. But even when I was first presented with that about him, I knew so little about ADHD beyond the absolute top level stereotype. So I think it's really helpful to be honest with people, because it can show actually how fascinating and nuanced this actually is as a condition. And you said a few things there and it really related to me. I was like, oh my God, I hate forms with a passion. Like filling out a form to me is actual torture.
And attention. And the thing that's difficult for perhaps neurotypical people to understand is that ADHD doesn't bring with it a specific set of symptoms that neurotypical people don't feel. Everybody doesn't like queuing in a bank, right? Nobody likes queuing in the supermarket when you get there and there's a long queue. Everybody knows what it feels like to be impatient and intolerant, but it's sort of so amplified, it's next level. And I should also say that I'm a recovering alcoholic, and addict, and have been for 26 years. So I was in rehab when I was 25. So I'm very, very open-minded about mental health. It's not like I'm like our parents were, because ADHD and mental health was just not a thing when I was a kid in primary school. It just wasn't. You were naughty, you were disruptive, you daydreamed, you didn't pay attention, you were a fidget. That was it. And it was all dealt with by discipline and sort of force in a sense. So I was coming from a place where I was very open-minded and I still thought ADHD was a bit made up. And it just was extraordinary to find out more about it.
I like your analogy from a diabetic perspective, but the childhood lens is an important one, because actually when it comes to assessing and diagnosing adult ADHD, those symptoms have to have been present and impairing before the age of 12. So I'm going to ask you to look back on your childhood now. When you do look back on your childhood, which you touched upon then through the ADHD lens that you have now, I'm wondering when you first realised that you experienced the world differently and how that feels. So beyond the symptoms and the challenges themselves, I guess, just to elaborate a little bit more on what you were saying about how you might have felt in certain circumstances and how that maybe differed from others.
I think, with a child's eyes, I suppose, because you don't have the vocabulary that you have as an adult, as a child. So your self-talk is much more basic, So I think I felt different. I looked at other children and I felt probably envious, because I used to think it's not fair. They seem to find it so easy, and I don't find it easy, and I don't know what it was that I wasn't finding easy, but it didn't feel fair. And I was popular at school. I was precocious. I was, and I had lots of friends, but I changed my friends all the time. I never had even all the way through secondary school, there were sets of girls who were best friends, and they were best friends, and and that was their best friend. Me, I changed my best friend every month, because I would get so use them all up and then be bored and then on to the next person. And so I think that I felt like low level there was something a bit wrong with me, and I felt envious that everybody else seemed to find everything easier. And from a classroom point of view, and we now know that they used to think ADHD was predominantly a male condition, but what we've learned is that it's fairly equal, but girls are really good at masking. So whereas boys are not so good. So boys are fidgety and disruptive, whereas what happens is that girls are told and they look at their peers and they mask. So they sort of almost act in a way. And the downside to that, which now everything retrospectively since my diagnosis, I can look back, is that as a child, I had to internalize and behave and sit still and concentrate in class. And so by the time I was 10, I started having terrible panic attacks and anxiety attacks. And I think that was just because of physically the internalizing of all the stress and the anxiety that I couldn't just express in my day-to-day life. And there should have been a medical intervention. I started playing piano and organ when I was 9 years old. I had this freakish talent for it. It's the only way I can describe it. And I just got really good really fast. And I was performing, and I wrote a piece of music that was played at the Royal Festival Hall when I was 10. And
wow.
I started teaching piano and organ when I was 11 years old after school. And I did all the Royal Academy exams and plenty of festivals and recitals and competitions. And I used to get incredibly nervous before I performed. And I had no help. My mum, bless her, who was a scientist and a mathematician, and was navigating this sort of strange child who was a pain in the arse, but very lovable and brilliant at music, thank God, and had absolutely no skills to deal with my emotional stuff. So it was just like, you'll be fine, and there was so everything was internalized. And I did have a really chronic anxiety condition from the age of about 10 right up until my early 20s. But I still functioned in life. I still went to school every day. I still had friends. I was still sociable. I still did all my music. It was just really, really tough.
Mm. And you said then that, there should have been a medical intervention, because it's obviously having such a profound impact on you that's how it's sort of manifesting. And you also touched on earlier a little bit about the way in which those things were then sort of navigated and handled in school in those days. And I sort of wonder what you wish your parents and maybe even your teachers had understood about you then.
I think now watching friends of mine with neurodiverse children, it's heartwarming to watch how they are able to support the child because of the awareness that we have. So my goddaughter has 3 children, and her eldest daughter has diagnosed ADHD, and she's like a little me. And when I spend time with them, she follows me about and she's twittering and she's chatty. And, she's very bright. And we get in the car and we go to the supermarket and she's chatty. But she's been diagnosed, and and her middle daughter, who's in a mainstream school, has been diagnosed as autistic. And there are just little things that the school do and that my goddaughter does, which visibly have a huge impact and make life so much easier. There's just this one thing at school where the middle girl, they would do this thing where I think after lunch, after they came back from lunch, they would all go and sit on the carpet, and the teacher would talk them through what they were going to do that afternoon. And then they would get up and they would go to their desks. And my friend's middle daughter, by the time she got to the desk, she would just sit there and she just couldn't remember what they'd talked about. And what they discovered is it was a transitional thing. It was about literally sitting and being on carpet and then moving to a desk, which is a completely different environment. So what they do is that every day when they do this, they write down the bullet points and give it to her on a piece of paper, and she takes that back to her desk. And it's just made her life so much less stressful. And whereas she used to come out of school where she'd have to be masking all day and behaving, and then my goddaughter would pick her up and she'd be banging the back seat of the car and there'd be meltdowns at home. She comes out now and she's, how was school? Yeah, it was great. And I so wish I'd had those things, but it just, it didn't. I think I probably wouldn't have ended up with the chronic anxiety disorder, which was really difficult to navigate. And it would have just made my day-to-day life easier.
There's a power in understanding yourself like that. And you touched on it earlier a little bit when you talked about how you felt after your own diagnosis, and you could understand that these challenges, things that you'd faced throughout your life, were actually as a result of a physical condition, as you called it. And I think the ability to then offer yourself that kindness and understanding when you can see it in a particular way has such a significant impact. And what you were saying there about your goddaughter is so true of my daughter. She's the exact same, high masker, but struggles with that exact same transition. And actually they did a similar thing in school, very simple thing, where actually they allowed her to stay at her desk so that she's 9, that information, that point wasn't lost in her working memory and moving from the carpet to the table. And actually sometimes it's just these tiny little things, isn't it, in that life that allow us to understand ourselves and our brains a little bit better, and then be kinder to ourselves in the process, because they have a sort of cumulative effect, don't they? And you also talked a little bit then about your music from such a young age, and I wondered, obviously our parents didn't understand this stuff about ourselves, right? Did they? I feel like I am learning so much about myself, almost in sort of parallel to navigating this stuff for my children. But at the same time, I wonder whether there was anything that your kind of parents or teachers did right without almost having a knowledge and awareness of what they were doing at the time. Like, for example, you talked about that music and the skill and talent you had, and clearly there was an ability to really channel that from a young age. And was there anything that you feel was sort of facilitated for you almost unknowingly when you were a child?
I think, there were definitely practical things that my mum did which were helpful. So my mum was actually a school teacher. She was a deputy headmistress of the primary school that I attended. And then obviously when I went into secondary school, she used to leave me post-it notes everywhere. Don't forget you've got a piano lesson after school. Don't forget to take your gym kit. Don't forget to blah, blah, blah. So there were all these reminders constantly. That was practically helpful. My parents were good people. They were ill-equipped to deal with a neurodiverse child. They did their best, but I really didn't have any emotional or psychological support. I would find friends who were similar to me. So I got a lot of support from my friends, and we would sit in our bedroom sort of like talking about stuff. And, that's where I found my support, I suppose. But yeah, no, I didn't get any real emotional support because they didn't have the knowledge. They didn't understand. They just thought I was a naughty kid that needed, keeping in line. And yeah, no, there was nothing. There was a music teacher. My music was a great outlet for me. I guess it was therapeutic in a way. I used to come home from school and I just loved playing piano and organ, and I just would race through all the books and I just loved it. But I did that very ADHD as well. Yeah. I managed to do all my Royal Academy music exams and pass them all with distinction without hardly doing any focused rehearsal. The idea that I would have sat down and practiced for like 2 hours a day was a nonsense. I always left everything till the last minute. The same with all my GCSEs. I couldn't revise. I could never do my homework. I was always doing my homework in the locker the morning. It had to be handed in, in the locker room. And the same with my music stuff. I would wait till the last minute and then sort of manage to pull it out of the bag. No, I was kind of out there floating alone, which is why, and I survived. And I look back on my life. And when I was first diagnosed, I went through a phase, not for very long, where I was really angry because I thought, God, my life would have been just so much easier with just a bit of awareness. And, what was going on? I felt like I'd been failed by all the adults in my life. How could they not see that I was crippled with anxiety and really struggling? And, I used to walk out of assembly a lot because I used to have panic attacks. I'd be in school assembly, and this was in my primary school, but also in my secondary school. And I would suddenly have this terrible panic attack, and I would have to walk out of assembly and go into the toilets and calm down. And, I just think, but I don't think there was the awareness. And like I said, I was smart and funny, and I could play the piano, and I had friends, so I was a functioning person. But the fact that I survived it is a miracle. I look back now and I think, God, I don't know if I could survive that now, that level of anxiety.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because as you say, I think generationally they didn't have that understanding and they didn't have that know-how. And I guess the amazing thing now is that we can really learn about ourselves and then in turn help support, which is in many ways what this podcast is about, actually really helping to support parents and children as they navigate this to make sure they don't experience the same thing. But as you said, you did survive it, and we do survive it. And I guess it kind of really shapes who you are. So I'm wondering what challenges that you struggled with when you were a child would you now perhaps consider to be your greatest strengths, or even, and I know some people do and don't like this word, but I do, I like it, is superpowers as an adult, because often the very things that we struggle with can become our strengths and our drivers in life.
I'm with you. I feel like, would I be a different person? What would my life look like now if I'd had all the support and help that perhaps is available today? I know that there would have been less anxiety, but as a result of, we're all on our own journey, and I do believe we live the life we're meant to live. And when I was diagnosed at 50, my life was not in tatters. I was not struggling to get through the day. I had a wonderful life. I'm married. I've been with my partner for 25 years. I'm 25 years sober. I'm successful in my creative work. I've got friends. I travel. I don't have huge levels of anxiety anymore. So I feel the same way about superpower. My worry with it is that if we keep saying that neurodiverse people have got superpowers, it means that kids without ADHD haven't got superpowers. And of course, we all have superpowers. It's about
Absolutely.
But your superpower may be looking slightly different. I did a book launch to a load of children. We were like, what's your superpower? And for some children, it was like eating vegetables. But for some, they said ADHD. But for others, it was, I'm very kind. Every child has a so-called superpower. It's just that it's going to be a little bit outside the box, I think, if your child is neurodiverse and possibly creative. I've seen many with ADHD, they do tend to favour creative expression more, in a sense, than perhaps going into science or mathematics or geography or teaching or something that's a bit more structured. But my strengths, I have a load because of the ADHD. One of my superpowers is that I get shit done, like super fast. I will do, it sounds like arrogance. It's just a fact. When I'm arranging for an orchestra or decorating a house or anything that I'm doing that I'm committed to, I will do in one day what it would take a normal person 5 days to do. It's just a fact, right? It's just a fact. When I work, I go into this hyper focus at my, I'm doing some at the moment for a project I'm working on, and I bring up my orchestral score and I do in 2 hours, like 2 days work. And then I feel a bit worn out. But if you can make it work for you, and it's like, if there's a project that needs doing, send me in. I'm your girl.
Yeah.
And I also think as well that I have, I'm able to have real empathy with people and their difficulties without judgment, just from my own experience. But, they think some of our greatest minds were neurodiverse. Mozart, Einstein, and you look at Mozart, so prolific, that mind of just constantly churning stuff out. So it's about channeling it. And I think I was speaking to a friend of mine the other day, and I thought, this is tricky, because the way that ADHD in particular, but perhaps other diverse conditions present, appears as bad behavior and bad manners. So it's like fidgeting, not paying attention, interrupting. And then, of course, you have, if there are any sensory issues, meltdowns and sort of frowns and rudeness and I don't want that and tantrums. And how do you tell whether this is just a kid being naughty and pushing boundaries, which is what kids do, and that they need discipline, like stop this, go to your room, I'm taking your phone away, you absolutely cannot behave like this, or whether this is a symptom of their neurodiverse condition, in which case discipline is just going to make them mask and internalize it. And what is really needed is something else, which is, I can see you're in real difficulty here. Let's take some breaths. Let's try to find some words. Or understanding that it's not because the child doesn't want to wear these tights and they're being a dick. It's because they physically can't stand the touch of this wool on their feet today. Because sometimes it's going to be bad behavior that needs a knock that off, go to your room, absolutely not. But sometimes it's going to need a chat. I don't have children, I have dogs, and whether my dogs are neurodiverse or not, I mean, who knows? But they generally do what they're told, and when they're naughty, I'm like, ah! But I don't have real children. I just have furry ones. But most of my friends have real children, and some of them are neurodiverse, and I'm like, how are you going to tell whether your 8-year-old is just being naughty and needs to be disciplined, or is struggling with some sensory thing or communication thing? I don't feel like that's advice. I feel like that's a question too. It's that would probably need somebody who's more specialist in the field of ADHD.
Yeah, I like to think of it as that all behaviour is communication. And actually, if you've got a child who's diagnosed, or you're going down that pathway and you're seeing patterns of behaviour and you're seeing environments that typically exacerbate or bring on certain things, it's just stepping back and starting to question kind of what's driving this and trying to understand the root cause, and then leading that with compassion. And, boundaries are really important, but often, the ADHD brain, it doesn't respond well to consequence. Actually, it can be completely counterintuitive because, as we sort of touched on earlier, those negative messages that children are constantly getting about themselves just get further and further and further reinforced, and you end up with these sort of vicious cycles. But actually, if we can approach things in a different way and really sort of hook into their natural reward system in their brain and those dopamine pathways that we talked about, that can actually be much, much more effective. But I think for parents who are listening on this ADHD journey, in many ways, what you have to offer within your story is that crystal ball. It's the looking ahead, it's the sense of hope, because there are times when I know I personally have been absolutely on my knees with this, and that's experience that is shared by many parents. And sometimes it's just looking for that reassurance, that what it's like at the other side of this.
I mean, I carved out a life for myself without any support, guidance, emotional support, psychological help, wellness, anxiety, intervention, anything. I carved out a really wonderful life for myself, and, with a husband and friends and a career that I love. And, so you do survive. You do. I mean, like, you were undiagnosed, you have children, you have a life, it just would have been so much less stressful. And I think now, with the awareness and the support, if you can do it without any support and any awareness, imagine what you're going to achieve with the support and awareness. I mean, my friends who have neurodiverse children, these children are thriving. because they're having the meltdowns about the tights and the socks and, the inability to express. Because I think I always say to my husband, God, I just find it so difficult to articulate what I'm thinking, because it just comes out as a string of words. And sometimes I think that's not what I meant at all, But when you're children, you don't have the vocabulary that you have as an adult. So when you're struggling internally and emotionally, and there might be sensory things going on, you don't have the physical words to. It's just sort of like a feeling. And I watched a friend of mine navigate with her daughter. The level of patience and tolerance that I think parents have to have with children anyway, and then with a neurodiverse child, must be just like tearing your hair out, And I look back and I think, I was parented a certain way, so it's probably great that I don't have kids, because I think you do tend to parent them a bit like your parents. It's like goes into your DNA or something. So I worry that I would have been gone like, stop this nonsense. Like, right, stop crying. Right, okay, go to your room. When actually the child needed to be talked to and sort of walked through it. But yeah, I think with support and, awareness, these neurodiverse children have so much to offer the world, because we're outside the box thinkers. We're going to come up with a solution to something that somebody who thinks more laterally perhaps won't. And, if you look at the arts and entertainment, I mean, riddled with people who have got neurodiverse conditions and perhaps don't even know it. I know several artists that I hang out with and I'm like, oh my God, you are so good with ADHD. But some of them are like, in their 70s now. And you think, well, but you use it to your benefit, to your advantage. So I would say to parents, observe your children and see what their superpower is, whether it's art, drama, swimming, eating vegetables, whatever, and encourage that as their outlet. And just do your best. Because as a parent, you're teaching your children about boundaries in the world, and they, it's not safe. They have to learn and listen to parents, but also there's a place for the emotional, psychological, okay, what's really going on here? And understanding that sometimes in the middle of a meltdown, children can't tell you. My friend's daughter, if she's had like a massive meltdown and been really mean to her mum, which she sometimes is, when she comes to the other side of it, she comes back and she goes, I'm so sorry I was mean to you, mummy. I really didn't mean it. I was just so angry. So there is an awareness there within the child as well.
I think what you said is really lovely. It's like, if you can achieve and carve out a life for yourself without understanding and awareness, imagine what you can achieve with that. And I think that's such a lovely message, because we're kind of actively trying to change things for our children and for other people's children as well, as they kind of navigate this world. And as you said also about your friends that you look at, even those who are much older and you can see it a mile away, actually you do manage to carve out a life for yourself, and you do manage to turn actually many of these challenges, but also inherently the strengths, into those interests, and really follow, once you get that freedom outside of the school system, to really carve out a path for yourself in life that allows you to just be who you are and really channel those strengths. And I think that often, well, certainly from my experience, feels like the point that things really start to change. I think that really does offer a message of hope for those listening. And obviously on the topic of carving out life and playing into your strengths with you and your music, before we finish, tell us about your beautiful book, B.
So B came about first as a ballet. And when people ask me about the ballet, it's always embarrassing to admit the truth, which is that I've always found writing music really easy. And I've found writing lyrics much harder. I think it's an ADHD focused thing, because it's structured, and whereas music is just, at the piano. So I just finished writing a big musical, which had 26 songs in it, and I'd written the music and I'd done the lyrics as well. So I was like, I'm going to do something without lyrics. So I just have to do the music. So I thought, I know what I'll do a ballet, because there's no words. I won't have to write any words. And I thought, well, I'll have to write a story, but that's okay, because I can just, map out the story. So that's where the story of B came from. It was just, about a child who struggled to fit in, who could fly, and who could talk to fairies and had this sort of imaginary world. And so I wrote the music and stories, so scenes. And then I met with a friend of mine who's a novelist, and she listened to the music and she looked at the storyboard and she said, this should be a children's book. She has a son who is autistic. She said, this should be a children's book. So I was like, oh, okay. So that's how the children's book came about. And then with that, it was really taking the storyboard from the ballet and putting it into chapters and a language that children would understand. And then I wanted to include the music as well. So that's how the book came about.
I think the music is such a lovely touch. I read it with my daughter actually for the first time at bedtime, and she's a dancer, so she's very inspired by music, and she's always kind of choreographing different pieces. But actually what I found for particularly an ADHD child, and she's 9, so she's probably at the older end of the people who would naturally enjoy your book, the music was really engaging. It was engaging for her because she struggles to stop moving. So bedtime's difficult because the minute her body has to stop, her brain wakes up. But also for me as a mum, I actually found that the music helped me be really present. And I find bedtime hard. I find that point in the day where I'm really tired and my brain's on all the millions of things I still have to do. Actually, it kept me very focused and in the moment with her, not least because it's obviously beautiful and so calming in many ways.
Like really super happy to hear that. And perhaps with your daughter, because she likes to choreograph, might be interesting to say to her, like, pick one of these tracks, and then why don't you make your own dance and your own movement to try and show how you sometimes feel about feeling different, or struggling to fit in, or it's interesting because kids who like to use movement and dance as an expression, I think that's the thing I would say as well, that the arts are a really good outlet for neurodiverse, anxious energy, drama, painting, music, dancing, all of it. And this is why when they talk about cutting the arts in schools, it makes me so mad, because
me too.
We are not encouraging children here to be writers and actors and painters, because we all know that it's like 1 in 10 million people who are ever going to make a serious living. You've got like Damien Hirst, you've got J.K. Rowling, you've got like Nicole Kidman. If you want to become an actor, the chances of you becoming a famous actor are really small. That's not what the arts are about in schools. You're doing all your other subjects, all your English and your science. This is like therapy for children. They should have an arts period every day. So nobody knows what's going on for that child at home. Nobody knows what's going on and how they're feeling. So if you're going to sit them in a desk for like 6 periods out of 7 to educate them, they have to have, they've got playtime and break time where they can somewhere where they can put their anxiety or their difficulties or out of their body sort of like into the art. And so when I hear about the government cutting arts, it makes me want to it makes me go quite mental. Like, I want to actually get hold of the arts person and just say, this is about children's mental health. This is not about encouraging them to be, because actually my mum, ever since I was really small, the thing that I loved was to compose. I loved writing. And my mum would not encourage that. In fact, and I don't want to make her out to sound horrible, and this does sound horrible, God bless her, she's not with us anymore. She was great, my mum. But if I said to her, Mum, come and listen to this, come and listen, I've written this piece of music, as I was playing it, she would leave the room, because she could see that the chances of me ever making a successful living as a songwriter was tiny. So she wanted me to study and be a teacher, because it was a proper job with a proper salary. And then what? I could get a mortgage and be happy, and live a decent, successful, financially stable life. This is not about the arts in schools. It's not about that. It's about giving children a break and a breather so that they can take the anxiety and get it out into the art, the drama, the acting, the music, the singing, the dancing, it's so important.
Yeah, it's an expression, isn't it? And also, I think it's important that children have the ability to have that outlet without it being judged or measured as well, because, then often if we don't have perhaps a natural skill in those areas, then that we just add that to our list of things that we're not very good at, rather than just actually allowing it as a platform in which just to have a little bit of mindfulness or express yourself. I mean, even if it's something as simple as colouring in, just what that can achieve for you in that moment in time.
I so wanted to be a good dancer, and I so wanted to be a good artist, and I was shaped like a potato, and I could not dance, and I cannot draw.
And yet you are so phenomenally talented with your music. And that's the thing, isn't it? We all have our strengths and we all have our skills, and it's giving children the opportunity, I think, to explore those and then shape their self-esteem positively around the things that they are good at and that they enjoy regardless. Rachel, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today.
I learned so much just talking about it. I think, my husband must be bored senseless with me talking about ADHD all the time. But thank you. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Oh, it's been so lovely talking to you. And so many things that you said resonated really deeply with me, just as an individual as well. When you said about you're the person that gets stuff done. I remember having a job interview where someone asked me to really sum up, what's the thing that people come to you for? And that was my answer, to get stuff done. That's absolutely 100% me. And my husband always says that
10 times than anyone else.
Yeah, 100%. That's what I was going to say. My husband always says he thinks I get more work done in a day than typical people get done in a week. So yes, I'm with you. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your story with us today and for creating your beautiful book, B. We will obviously include a link to your book in our show notes. So thank you, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. If you'd like to find out more about Rachel's work and to buy a copy of her book B, then please do check out our show notes below for more information. Or if you'd like to find out about how I can help support you and your children with personalised ADHD coaching, then please do head to allaboardadhd.com. You can also find me on Instagram and TikTok at All Aboard ADHD. Most importantly, if you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, please can you follow and review All Aboard to help other parents find this podcast and welcome them aboard our journey too. Thank you for listening to All Aboard ADHD.